Another Lumen Terminal Pro, Pro Photo and Video Comparison video, and probably the last one in the series, Praise Gear. Just kidding. What we're going to take a look at is the Mac Studio, and we're going to focus on the M3 Ultra, the base and the top silicon. When you reach the top, we're now talking about a $1,500 price delta. So we're going to do a lot of testing in a Pro Photo and Video workflow to determine if this is actually a worthwhile upgrade or not with the current apps and the current operating system that we have right now. And also address one more thing too. Does Apple have a problem at the top end where you're not seeing that much more performance gain for a fairly large price jump? There's a lot to talk about. Let's jump right in. I'm ArtIsRight. As usual, I'll be sharing lots of information. Please pause this video so you can analyze the result yourself. In addition to the analysis I'll be sharing with you, timestamp to the various tests will be in the description, although it may not be available when the video launch. This channel is fully self-funded. If you find information helpful, you want to help support the channel, a link to my tip jar will be in the description. YouTube Super Thanks works. You can also choose to join the channel membership. And when appropriate, if you don't mind sharing these videos with your peers that are looking for similar information, I would greatly appreciate that. And if the only thing that you can do is tapping on the like button, this way YouTube algorithm will push this to an even larger audience. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. This way we can grow our audience member. I would greatly appreciate that as well. Lastly, remember this is a one-person channel, so please be kind in the comments. This is going to be a redacted, shorter version of video of the ultimate comparison that I've done. For that video, it will have all the compilational chart that include the desktop, laptop machine for all the previous generation. This one, we're only going to focus on the desktop machine. And particularly, we're only going to focus on these two machines that I have mentioned in the beginning. So if you want to see a full video, like I said, link to it will be in the description. Now for this, we'll be taking a look at the M3 Ultra for both the base and top silicon. And when I'm talking about base and top, I'm only referring to the silicon. Now this one is a custom built. This is mine. It has 256 gigabytes of memory. Normally you would have 96 gigabytes of memory. So I did go in there and do a bump, but I do want to point out a few more things using the Apple configuration chart on their website. Lumen Terminal Pro, obviously we're not doing that right now. Yes, we're going to take a look at the Ultra. So with this, both the machines are the same right now. However, if I go in and upgrade to the top M3 Ultra, we're talking about a $1,500 price delta, all the while the amount of memory and also the SSD remains the same. So you may wonder, what would be the reason to go in and upgrade to the top M3 Ultra silicon? That is, if you want to have, for instance, access to 512 gigabytes of memory. Unless you really need that kind of memory, or you're constantly working with very large files, very large data set all the time, majority of us creative are not really going to be utilizing 512 gigabytes of memory. Now, I will also say that if you are a music composer, I have known some that will go in and max out memory on the system with all the instrument running and everything. And in that case, it might make sense and you might have to go with a top machine. But for Pro Photo and Video, for the most part, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So let's go back and let's see the machine performance and see how they compare. Now, with this, you're also going to see the result from the M2 Max, M1, M2 Ultra, and also the M4 Pro. So with this in mind, a configuration and buyer guide will be towards the end of this video. There are consumer and pro-oriented segmentation to the silicon. Because we're talking about the pros, I'm not going to spend too much time on this one. And the upgrade priority still remains the same. Choose the amount of memory you want in your system first, even though we are so tied in with this M3, M4 generation that we can't really just go in and choose the amount of memory you want because the multipliers are all kind of different, right? And once you go in and choose the amount of memory you want, a lot of times you're going to be limited to a shift family, meaning that if you want more, you have to jump up right away. So for instance, if you want more than 128 gigabytes of memory, you have to go with the Ultra. There's no other way about that. If you have extra money left, SSD would still give you a good performance per dollar, but memory is going to give you the most. And lastly, the shift variance. The spending the $1,500 upgrade from the base to the top one is the last on the list because you're not going to see that much more performance bump. All of this really comes down to justification at the end of the day. Take a look at your career, where you are. One of the examples I always give is I've been doing this for over 20 years now, so I want to have the fastest machine possible to run in my studio. I don't want to wait, I don't want to delay, but if you're just starting out, maybe spending this kind of money on a machine is not worthwhile right now. And you might want to consider one of those, for example, M4 Max that are an extremely great value this time around. So there are multiple ways to really look at this, but look at what you do the tasks you spend the most time doing, and also where you are in your career and how you value your time. Those things are also going to play a role. Mind you, that majority of tasks we're doing right now, testing these top-end machines, are in the single-digit numbers in terms of timing. So it's really not going to make that much of a difference overall. I'll be taking a pro perspective on all this, and we're going to be doing a single app testing. Now, there are a lot of naysayers out there that says all this test is invalidated for so many different reasons. It's okay. I'm going to still do what I do because I think that majority of you are still finding great information from these videos. There are other configurations that I cannot test. If you have to max out one, you want me to like have some time on your machine, especially if in SoCal, do let me know. I would love to have some time on your machine. I've also done reference testing because there are multiple different app versions and also OS upgrade. So I have validated with all these testing using different random machines that I pull out to run all the tests over again, and the results are the same. So we are pretty much good to go on this one. And regarding optimization, we're starting to see more apps going in and optimize for the cores and everything, but many of them are still using brute force on the system. So the design for the Mac Studio, as you see on my desk right now, there's still a brick, and the fan are pretty much running fairly silently for that matter, but there is a low power mode now. So if you're in a recording studio, this may be more beneficial to you. Rather than locking the Mac Studio into like a case somewhere, you can probably have it like on your workstation, depending on how your workflow is. Again, I don't do sound, so I don't really know about those. Now, when it comes to calibration, both hardware and software calibration pass without any problem, so you can calibrate it with all of those and get good color on day one. My recommendation, especially if you are a creative and you're coming from an Intel machine, is to set this up as a brand new machine. You'll have a much more cleaner and better experience that way. Here is how you read the specs across all the machines that I am about to test. And let's quickly talk about SSD. Now, this one comes with 1 terabyte SSD, which I think is the bare minimum. Personally, for me, it is the bare minimum. Yours might be 512, but I wouldn't go with anything less than that. The SSD, by the way, you can always expand this with an external storage SSD, hard drive, NAS, DAS, and so forth, and the speed is plenty fast enough. Now, if you really want to know if these programs and app that we're using on a daily basis can utilize these higher speed SSD or not, I've made a video testing this a while back. I'll leave a link in the description because it is still valid today as it was back then. So you don't need to always go out and chase the highest speed possible. Now, I do admit that on the faster SSD, you get a much higher speed ingress and egress, meaning that when you download and you export the file, but ultimately there are so many variables to place in that role that I wouldn't just upgrade SSD just for that kind of speed. Now, when it comes to RAM, it's tied to the silicon. There is no way to upgrade. If you're going to keep your machine for a very long time, I would think about upgrading your RAM now so that you don't have to buy a new machine in the near future, so that your machine will last longer. Now, we're talking about high-end machines here, so the RAM are probably more than plenty, starting at 96. That's a pretty good amount. If you are a Mac user and you want to know if the amount of RAM that you have is good enough or not, I highly recommend restarting your machine. The reason why I recommend that is so that you start fresh and go through your day workflow, monitor for like about a day, 2, or maybe 3 days. Literally, restart a machine, launch Activity Monitor, go into the Memory tab, and just monitor memory pressure. Tile this window in a way that you can see this on the side, and just start opening Safari. If you're the kind of person that have too many browsers running like me and have too many tabs open, do that so that you can find a number that is best suited for your workflow. If you're in the green, you're pretty much good with the amount of memory you have. If you're in the yellow and you're red, you might want to consider upgrading. Now, at the high end, if you have to come down from like 128 to like 96 gigabytes of memory, is that going to be that big of a deal? I would say not so much, but if you're going, for example, from like 36 down to 18, I think that is going to be, you know, quite a bit of a cut, or 48 down to like 24. So where you are, it's going to matter too in terms of like amount of memory. If you're on the higher end of things, not going to make that big of a difference. If you're on the lower end of things, yeah, it is going to make that much of a difference. So it's a logarithmic curve. Anyway, one program that I really like, and I'm not sponsored by them, is iSnap Menu 7. I highly recommend checking them out. I use this to monitor my memory pressure, and I can keep track of it like for about 28 days. It's a really useful tool to have. I've also been noticing a slowdown trend over the years, and interestingly enough, when I was testing the M1 Ultra, the very first one that came around, literally the timing of it for Lightroom Export was much shorter than many of these machines that I have today. I don't have a chart showing that. If you want to see a video just discussing that, do leave them in the comment section below, and I'll, you know, look into doing those videos. So let's take a look at Lightroom Classic. When we compare these two machines, we're talking about a minute faster. Now, another thing that I do want to point out is that my machine is this is the price of it. But if you're taking a look at the stock configuration between these two, is 1,500 apart. This is a task that utilizes CPU only. So the amount of memory, especially when we get to these high end, unless I specify on the chart at the very top that it's really utilizing RAM, it's not really going to make that much of a difference. And in majority of tasks I'm going to show you, even though I specify that, it doesn't make too much of a bearing or a variation. But interestingly enough, you're paying about $1,500 more to upgrade the silicon to gain a timing of 1 minute when these are all in a single digit. I don't think it's really worth it, but if your 1 minute is really worth that much, then yeah, it's definitely something to consider. Here are all the other machines in the lineup, so you can think about them. And for Export 1K. Now this one is starting to show a little bit more of time variation. It's still about a little bit over a minute. Is this that big of a deal? I don't think so. It is faster, don't get me wrong. If you take a look at these variation in terms of percentage, yeah, it does make that much of a difference, but the reality is we're still dealing with a finite time. We don't deal with time in percentage, right? So when we take a look at this, a minute, right, and something that's already under 5 minutes overall, it's not really that much justifiable. How about the rest of the other machines in the lineup? This is where the spread is. And what about Lightroom Classic HDR Merge? When it comes to this, the timing, it's pretty much about the same because this just go in and utilize a single CPU. Same generation. In fact, the M4 generation is running faster, so something to think about there. Panorama Merge. This is a task that goes in and use CPU and RAM in combination, so having more RAM on the system, it's going to help. Although, for this particular task, all of it can literally be run on the memory on the system already. That's why we're only seeing about a 1 second variation, which is totally within a margin of error. So the timing, it's pretty much about the same. RAM doesn't play that much of a bearing in this particular task on these high-end machines. It starts to play a lot more of a bigger role in these machines that have less than, for example, 48 gigabytes of memory, as you are seeing there. So AI noise reduction. Is this going to be faster having more GPU cores because this is running on a GPU? Yes, but only by about a second. But what happens though when we do more than just one AI image noise reduction that uses a GPU? By the way, this task is supposed to run on the NPU, but there are some issues. That's why it's still running on the GPU right now. Here's the timing for the rest of the machine, and let's do noise reduction for 10 images now. And with this, we start to see more of a compound effect, right? Timing is shorter on the top spec one because there are more CPU, more GPU core. Now with this, we're taking a look at less than 20 seconds. Again, is it justifiable? If you take a look at this in terms of percentage, you're going to see a greater number than the actual timing. And I don't think percentage really plays that big of a role in here, even though some of you may want to see it. Here are the rest of the AI noise reduction spreading out. And let's take a look at AI, Sky, and Subject Mask. This is going to perform pretty much really close to the same within a margin of error. In fact, this one, the Base Ultra, is performing slightly better on this one by about a second. I would say all these are within a margin of error, and the M4 generation is still pulling out ahead because this task just utilizes the GPU, but it doesn't go in and utilize all the GPU. It utilizes just one single core, so that's probably the reason why we're seeing that in the newer architecture is faster. So Lightroom. This task is an export task that combines CPU, GPU, and RAM all together, and we are seeing that the top silicon is performing faster. Less than a minute though, but it is definitely faster. How does this compare to the rest of the other machine in lineup? That's what it looks like right there. And for Capture One, which does go in and utilize more of the resources on the system for both import and export now. So let's take a look at import. Not really. Now, interestingly enough, I ran this test a couple of times and the numbers always hovering at this particular value 2 minutes slower on the max ultra silicon, whereas on the base ultra silicon, this is the number, and I did run this test a couple of times. Now, this is something that we see on Capture One before, and I still think we're seeing that now, that at the very top end, or when you start to really bump things up a lot, Capture One doesn't really go and utilize those extra resources really well. In fact, it doesn't really utilize that well at all. And in this case, the base machine is the much better value. Here are all the other machines in a lineup. And this is where the top spec machine is sitting right now, below the 2 max. It's supposed to be above it, but there are some anomalies that happen that doesn't account for that, or that you can't go in and utilize the resources well. That's why that's happening. Now, what about for export? I think it's doing a lot better, and this is really going in and just utilizing the GPU, and we're now seeing the extra 20 GPU cores performance. It's less than 30 seconds of a time improvement, more so like in a 20-something range for a $1,500 price variation. I don't think this is that much worthwhile, and this is the reason why it's important to do all these testing with the current app that we're using today, the current app that you and me have access to, because on paper, there's more, but it does not always translate. All right, so for Photoshop tests, I am using digital Lloyd chamber test for this one. We'll be doing 3 of them. Let's start out with Photoshop Speed. Slightly faster in the top one. This is a CPU-based only task. It's only milliseconds. I mean, realistically, it's only like what? 30 milliseconds. You're not even gonna know what hit you at that point, at that kind of time frame. Here's the rest of the other machines in the lineup, and for the very most part, it's less than 2 seconds apart still. So they're all pretty much mighty fast. What about Photoshop Medium? Timing is exactly the same. This can run on the memory for both of these machines, so it really doesn't matter which one you have, but we're not seeing any speed improvements. So for Photoshop, doesn't make a lot of sense. In fact, if you're doing a lot of Photoshop work, Max is a better silicon to get, but that is if your workflow predominantly revolves around Photoshop and the M4 generation. So for Photoshop Huge, 56 GB, all of these can still be run on memory, but we might start getting into paging files at this point, and 256 is pulling out ahead by a few seconds. So if we bump this up, the number will probably be really close, if not a little bit faster. And that's just a reality look at the whole thing. But all of this is still running on memory. And even though there are time variation, we're still talking about like a 3 seconds variation. It's really not that big of a deal. Here are all the other machines in the lineup for comparison. In fact, this is supposed to go up here. M2 Ultra is a little bit faster with slightly more memory there. I mean, I would say these are within a margin of error there, and you can see as we go down in the amount of memory, it just takes longer to run this particular task. Puget System, the numbers are almost identical for this one. And you can see right there, the numbers start to like with the rest of the other machines in the lineup there, but that's the Puget test. What about for Final Cut Pro encoder decoder engine? Remember that in the Ultra, we have double the encoder decoder engine compared to the Max Silicon. So these comes in and play a role quite a bit actually. So this is the reason why we're seeing the M3, or excuse me, just the Ultra Silicon in general coming up at the very top of the chart. Now we did not have access to the faster encoder decoder engine that comes with the M4 Max generation. You can see there how the M4 Max and the M1 Max, how they're just a little bit shorter there in terms of time. This is being repeated in HEVC H.265 as well. You can see the timing there is shorter, double encoder decoder engine, faster on the M4 generation, but doesn't have quite double the amount. And this is why the Ultra is still supreme right now, I think, if you're doing video. And lastly, the ProRes test. The top spec one is pulling out ahead of the other one by just a little bit there. I don't think it's really worth it for you to really like bump up for that, just for that tiny marginal gain. So what about AfterEffects benchmark? This is running on the CPU, and with this, we're taking a look at a timing variation of 21 seconds for $1,500. So think about that right there. And in future tests, I'll also put in the Puget bench score for this one. This is what we have for now, and understand there's a lot more that goes on in AfterEffects than just pretty much timing these, but this gives us a pretty good relative bearing where we are right now. Premiere Pro with Puget bench test, you can see almost identical to each other, less than 1,000 points apart. So you really need to ask yourself if this is a worthwhile upgrade or not. Like I said, I think if you're doing music and you can load the timeline in and you need extra memory that goes up to 512, it will make sense. Otherwise, I don't think it makes that much of a sense. Timing for Resolve with Puget bench, top one's coming out ahead, but by a very small margin, less than 1,000 again. Here are the rest of the other scores in the lineup. So there you have it. Base Ultra versus the top Ultra Silicon. This is nothing different than what we have seen with the M1 and also the M2 Ultra Silicon generation. When you really go up at the very top and you're paying $1,000 or $1,500 more, but you're not really seeing that much more performance gain. In fact, all of these tasks that I've run the tests on, if you really think about it, right? they're under 10 minutes. That means they're in the single digit timing. And to save 1 minute out of like from 3 to like 4 minutes, I don't think is that big of a deal anymore. So I think Apple have maybe a slight issue at the top end where when you really bump it up that much, you're supposed to see a huge performance jump, and we're not really seeing that. They're doing the performance tier on the silicon. And like I said, one of the reasons why you might want to upgrade to the top one is that if you need 256, but for pro photo and video, I don't really think you need that. And again, you know, like with all this, I know we're talking about the top silicon only, like the very top one that Apple has to offer, the Ultra, the base on the top one. But realistically, look at your workflow, look at where you are. I think that's going to make a lot of difference. Personally, for me, I just want things to be the fastest possible. I want the double encoder decoder engine because it makes a lot of sense for me. And one thing that I do want to mention about that too is that Apple released a video for like the Severance, like doing a promotion of that, and their editors were just using, for example, I believe the MacBook Air, MacBook Pro, and also the Mac Mini M4 and M4 Pro. I'm not really sure what silicon they're using there, but it can do the editing on the timeline and everything in Resolve just fine for that TV show, and that's great. But I do want to point out one thing too, is that in a full production workflow, like in Hollywood like that, the workflow is compartmentalized, meaning that the editors just really do edit and render on the timeline. They don't do the final rendering for export to upload to various streaming platforms and servers and so forth. So when we do work as a single creator, as a sole creator like myself, or in a small studio, we need to factor those things in. Yes, Apple machines are capable, but that's only showing you one aspect of it. There's the other aspect on the back end that the editors will probably not necessarily do, because once the editor edit, it goes into a color grading stage. So there's a color grading specialist that does all those that adjust it for HDR, and it goes into the export. And this is an oversimplification, but you get the idea. So for new purchases, what do you guys think? Or what do I think? I personally say the base M3 Ultra is really a great contender to think about. And you can watch my previous videos too, where I compare the base M3 Ultra with the top M4 Max silicon, because if you're gonna upgrade the M4 Max to the very top, you're looking at about a $300 price delta between that and the Ultra. And I think the Ultra is going to perform better in a lot of the tasks that requires a lot of the CPU and GPU, and it makes much more sense that way to upgrade to the Ultra in that regard. Now, if you already have a current machine, I say if you have an Ultra right now, why would you upgrade? You have a good machine already. I think you're just fine where you are. Or I would probably say, instead of looking at the current generation, maybe look at a refurb from Apple website, or a use or clearance M2 Ultra machine that can provide a really great value right now. Because those machines, you saw the results, are still holding their own just fine, right? So those are just really something to think about. Upgrade priority when it comes to the top end of these still remains the same, although there's a lot more of lock-in this time around. But memory upgrade is going to give you the most performance per dollar, although at the top end like this, I don't think you're going to see that much of a delta variation for both the memory and also the silicon upgrade, the silicon variants upgrade. And when it comes to all these tasks, depending on what you do, we're talking about Ultra here. So for the most part, they come up under the best category when you read them across for the different tasks you do. But for Photoshop, Ultra is not listed in there. So if you're predominantly doing Photoshop and just work with 1 or 2 images at a time, you're not dealing with batch amount of images in Lightroom, Lightroom Classic, or Capture One, I would probably just look at either the M4 Pro, M3, or M4 Max machine. Those are going to be a machine that can do you wonders, and you're going to save a lot of money that way. But if you do anything that requires CPU and GPU, as I have explained here, or if you also dabble in video as well, Ultra are the machine that I think make a lot of sense in that regard. And because we're at the top end already, the amount of RAM and SSD doesn't really matter much. There are plenty of them. Now, in terms of upgrade, depending on what silicon you are, the best way how I can tell you to do this is to circle where you are, do like a screenshot of this, and just look at the arrows. And a lot of times, for example, if you have M3 Pro, it may not be a bad idea to upgrade to the M1 Ultra. It might still be a fast machine, and you can get that machine at a really good value now. So there are multiple different upgrade paths. However, if you are already considering the M4 Max to the M3 Ultra, there are very specific scenarios where that makes sense. For the other ones, it might not make too much sense, especially if you don't go in and upgrade all the components on the machine, because at the stock prices, there are some variations in there that doesn't make it worthwhile. But overall, because we're talking about the top Ultra here, I don't think the upgrade to the top Ultra silicon has been worthwhile. And this has been repeated since the M1 Ultra and also the M2 Ultra generation. So we'll see if we get, like, for example, an M4 Extreme, an M5 Extreme or not. But also at the very top end, you gotta think about it, right? If they do release that silicon and it's $2,000 to $3,000 more, would you upgrade for maybe, like, you know, for half the time of like the base Ultra already? Would you upgrade? And that would be something to really think about, because we're talking about a $7,000 to $8,000 machine for a performance that's all going to be under 5 minutes anyway. Like, time compressed differently, right? So something to think about there. Anyway, if you have any questions or comment, leave them below. Give us a like, subscribe, and hit the bell if you're new. I'm Art, and I thank you for your time.